Bang, bang, bang. The gunshot echoed so violently it split the calm suburban morning in half. My ears rang, my chest froze, and in that instant I saw my service dog Mara stumble as the bullet grazed her side. The trigger was pulled by none other than Sabrina Cole, the HOA president. Everyone already whispered about the one we all called Karen. For me, a combat veteran fighting the invisible war of PTSD, Mara wasn't a pet. She was my lifeline, trained to pull me back from the edge when panic gripped me. But to Karen, she was an illegal animal, a direct violation of her beloved HOA bylaws. And with that one deafening shot, she crossed a line no rulebook could ever justify. What unfolded next wasn't just about me or Mara, it was about exposing how arrogance and power can push someone to commit a crime against both humanity and the law. And trust me, the revenge that followed was as unexpected as it was unforgettable. Before we dive in, comment your location and local time. I want to know where you're tuning in from. The sound of that gunshot still echoes in my skull whenever I close my eyes. It wasn't just the bang itself, it was the way it tore through the silence of an otherwise ordinary morning, ripping the calm apart and dragging me back to a battlefield I thought I'd left thousands of miles behind. Magnolia Springs was supposed to be my sanctuary, a neat suburban community in the south, with freshly mowed lawns and quiet cul-de-sacs. Instead, it became the setting for another war one. I never signed up for a war against an HOA president who thought her bylaws mattered more than federal law or human decency. Let me back up a little because you need to understand just how much Mara meant to me. After serving overseas, I came home carrying invisible wounds. PTSD was the doctor's label, but those 3 letters barely scratched the surface. Nights were endless battles filled with explosions in my head, days blurred together in a fog of panic and isolation. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus, and for months I barely stepped outside my front door. The smallest sounds, a car backfiring fireworks in July, would send my body into a full combat response. It felt like living with a loaded weapon inside my own chest, one that could fire at any moment without warning. Then came Mara. She was a German shepherd trained for service, not a pet I picked up for company. The first time she nudged me during a panic attack, applying steady pressure until my breathing slowed, I felt something I hadn't in years: safety. She got me out of the house, forced me to walk, to breathe fresh air, to remember that life wasn't all gunpowder and nightmares. Neighbors saw us walking every morning, a man and his dog, though for me she was my tether to sanity. That's when Sabrina Cole, the self-appointed queen of Magnolia Springs, decided to step in. She was the HOA president, mid-50 seconds, perfectly manicured hair, and lips that curled into a sneer every time she looked at me. She spotted Mara one morning, strutted over in her pastel cardigan, like she owned the entire street, and asked how long I was dog-sitting. When I explained that Mara was mine, and more importantly, my service animal, her expression soured. "This is a dog-free neighborhood," she snapped, jabbing her finger at me as if reciting holy scripture. "No exceptions. It's in the covenants you signed." I tried to stay calm, though my hands shook. "She's a service dog. Federal law allows her anywhere I live. She's not just a pet." Karen, because at this point, there's no other word for her, rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might spin right out of her head. "Oh, please. You walk just fine. You're not blind. You don't limp. You're just looking for an excuse to keep an animal against the rules. Some of us contribute to society instead of living off benefits, you know." That last line hit harder than any mortar blast. I wanted to scream, to tell her about the sandstorms, the gunfire, the brothers I lost overseas. I wanted to shout that I'd contributed more in 1 year of service than she ever would in her lifetime of petty HOA meetings. But the words froze in my throat. My body did what it always does. Under stress, it retreated. I went home, shut the door, and wrapped myself around Mara until the shaking stopped. For a while, I prayed that would be the end of it. Maybe she'd look up the law and realize she had no power here. But if there's one thing you should know about people like Karen, it's this: they don't back down. They escalate. And escalate she did. Within a week, flyers began appearing on mailboxes and doorsteps. "No dogs allowed in Magnolia Springs, protect our neighborhood." Printed in bold with a photo of Mara, attached like she was a criminal suspect. On the community Facebook group, she posted long rants about rule breakers and fakes abusing disability claims. My name wasn't mentioned, but everyone knew who she meant. Some neighbors ignored her, others whispered their sympathy in hushed tones, but nobody stood up publicly against her. Well, almost nobody. That's when Tom Wynn stepped in. Tom was a retired firefighter who lived 2 doors down. He approached me quietly one evening as I was bringing Mara back from a walk. "Hey," he said, lowering his voice. "I don't want to get dragged into politics, but you should know the HOA board is planning to review your case. Sabrina's pushing for a vote. They're looking for ways to say Mara doesn't qualify. Review my case, I asked. She's a service dog. That's not up for debate. Tom gave me a look that said exactly what I was already thinking. Logic and legality don't always matter to people drunk on power. Just be ready, he warned, and document everything. Every word she says, every flyer, every threat, you'll need it. So I did. I started carrying a small notebook, jotting down each interaction. I saved screenshots of her online posts, folded flyers into a folder, and I kept Mara's certification papers and ADA guidelines in my backpack wherever I went. It wasn't paranoia, it was survival. But paperwork couldn't prepare me for what happened next. One Saturday morning, the sound of distant gunfire drifted in from a hunting range outside town. My body tensed immediately, muscle memory dragging me back to the desert. Mara pressed against me, grounding me, pulling me toward calm. We walked down toward the small park in the center of Magnolia Springs, the place she loved most. I remember the sun shining through oak trees, the air still cool, the kind of morning that should have been peaceful. And then Karen appeared. She stood at the edge of the park with a revolver in her hand. At first I thought no, hoped she was bluffing, maybe showing off, but then she raised it. "If the HOA rules won't stop you," she shouted, voice trembling with rage, "then maybe this will—" The blast came before I could react. Mara yelped, collapsing sideways, blood spotting her fur. My heart seized. For a split second I was back in uniform, ambushed, adrenaline roaring through my veins. Except this time the enemy wasn't insurgents, it was a woman in pearls who thought she was judge, jury, and executioner of a gated community. I charged. Training took over where thought failed. I slammed into her, the gun clattering onto the pavement, her body sprawling beneath me. Shouts erupted from nearby houses, doors opened, phones appeared, cameras recorded. I wrestled the weapon away, pinning her wrist until police sirens wailed in the distance. By then, my body was shaking uncontrollably, sweat pouring down my back. I couldn't even hear the officers when they pulled me off her, my mind spinning out of control. My last clear thought before everything went black was Mara, bleeding, whimpering eyes searching for me. Then darkness swallowed me whole. When I woke, I was in a hospital bed with fluorescent lights glaring overhead and an IV dripping into my arm. A nurse hovered nearby, telling me I'd blacked out from the combined trauma and adrenaline. But I didn't care about me. My first word, hoarse and broken, was Mara. The nurse smiled gently. "She's alive. At the vet, wounded but stable. You'll see her soon." Relief washed over me so hard, I almost sobbed. For the first time since that gunshot, I felt the ground beneath me again. Mara had survived, and if she could fight through the pain, so could I. But as I lay there, the reality of what had just happened sank in. Karen had crossed a line that wasn't just cruel, it was criminal. She hadn't just violated HOA rules or harassed me. She'd fired a weapon at my medical equipment, at the one living being keeping me functional. And for that, she was about to face consequences she couldn't weasel out of. And so began the real battle, not of bullets and fists, but of laws, rights, and justice. The day after the shooting, Magnolia Springs felt like a different place. Neighbors who had always waved politely from across the street now stared through blinds or avoided eye contact altogether. The gunshot hadn't just rattled me, it had shattered the illusion of safety in a community that prided itself on peaceful living. For years, the HOA had enforced rules about mailbox colors and lawn height, but now those same rules had escalated into violence. And in the center of it all stood Sabrina Cole Karen, pretending she was a victim of circumstance rather than the aggressor who had pulled the trigger on my service dog. I didn't go home right away. The hospital insisted on keeping me overnight, monitoring my vitals, making sure I didn't spiral into another episode. PTSD isn't a wound you can stitch shut. It's a fire that flares whenever it smells smoke. Lying in that hospital bed, I replayed the scene over and over, the flash from her revolver, Mara's cry, the weight of Karen's wrist in my hand as I wrestled the gun away. Every loop made my chest tighten, until I thought it might cave in. When the nurse finally wheeled Mara into my room the next morning, the dam inside me broke. She limped slightly, her shoulder bandaged, but her tail wagged when she saw me. The vet explained that the bullet had grazed her, tearing skin but missing bone and vital organs. She would heal. Hearing that was like being handed my life back. Mara hopped onto the bed, ignoring every rule about sterile hospital sheets, and pressed her head against my chest. For the first time in days, my breathing steadied. But outside that hospital room, the battle lines were already being drawn. Karen had been arrested at the scene and charged with reckless discharge of a firearm, cruelty to animals, and assault with a deadly weapon. Yet by the time I checked my phone, she was already out on bail. That was Magnolia Springs, for you: money, influence, and the arrogance of someone who thought rules were for everyone else. She posted in the community Facebook group within hours, "Beware of fake service dogs in our neighborhood. HOA rules exist for a reason. I acted to protect the integrity of Magnolia Springs. Pray for justice." The comments were split. Half the neighbors condemned her outright, horrified that anyone would fire a gun in a family neighborhood. The other half, her loyal followers, parroted her words, calling me a fraud, saying Mara was a pet dressed up in a vest, accusing me of exploiting fake PTSD to skirt HOA bylaws. If it had just been insults online, maybe I could have ignored it. But Karen took things further. She started distributing printed flyers again, only this time in bold red letters, "No dogs allowed, stop the fraud." She included a blurry photo of me in uniform next to one of Mara, captioned, "If he's healthy enough to tackle me, he doesn't need a service dog." That one cut deep. She was twisting the very moment I fought for my life and Mara's into evidence against me. My hands shook as I crumpled the flyer, but Mara pressed against my leg, grounding me again. It wasn't the first time someone had doubted my condition, but it was the first time their words carried the weight of potential eviction. Then came the whisper from Tom Ewan again. He showed up at my door late one evening, his eyes darting around like he expected Karen herself to appear. "They're calling a board meeting," he said quietly. "Not just about you, about reviewing all exceptions to pet rules. But you and Mara are the target. She's trying to rally the board to vote you out." I felt the floor tilt under me. "She can't do that. Federal law." Tom raised a hand. "I know. I told them that. But Sabrina doesn't care. She thinks if the HOA declares Mara not legitimate, that'll hold up." He handed me a copy of the email circulating among the board members. It was filled with legal jargon, but boiled down to one idea: challenge my right to keep Mara by questioning the validity of my disability. In other words, put me on trial in front of my neighbors. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined standing in front of a room full of hostile faces, explaining the nightmares, the cold sweats, the panic that sent me running for cover when fireworks cracked. The law was clear: the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, protected my right to have Mara. But the thought of having to bear my scars to people who already believed Karen's lies made my stomach churn. The next morning, I called a lawyer. His name was Daniel Harris, a disability rights attorney in the nearby city. When I explained the situation, he didn't hesitate. "You're not the first veteran I've seen targeted like this," he said. "The ADA is crystal clear. They can't demand your medical records, they can't force you to disclose details. The only thing they're allowed to ask is she a service dog and what tasks is she trained to perform? That's it." Hearing that gave me a flicker of hope. But Daniel's tone was sharp when he added, "That doesn't mean they won't try to intimidate you. People like this bank on fear. My advice: document everything. Flyers, posts, threats. And if you can stomach it, show up at that board meeting. The law is on your side, but public perception matters too." So I prepared. I kept Mara's paperwork in a folder, printed out ADA guidelines. Even wrote a short statement about my service and my diagnosis. It wasn't easy. It felt like tearing open wounds in front of strangers, but if Karen wanted a fight, I wasn't going to retreat this time. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse was packed. Rows of folding chairs filled with residents, some curious, some angry, some whispering as Mara and I walked in. She wore her vest head held high as if she knew she was on duty. I tried to mirror her calm, though my heart was pounding. At the front sat the board, Sabrina in the center, like a queen presiding over her court. She smirked when she saw me, her face painted with smug confidence. "We are here," she began, her voice dripping with self-righteousness, "to address a violation of our community covenants. As you all know, Magnolia Springs is a dog-free neighborhood. Yet Mr. Walker insists on keeping a large German Shepherd, claiming it is a service animal." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. She went on about fake service animals, about neighbors' safety, about protecting property values. Each word felt like a stone thrown at my chest. When she finally gestured for me to speak, my legs almost refused. But Mara pressed against me, grounding me, and I took a breath. "I am a veteran of the U.S. Army," I began. "I live with post-traumatic stress disorder. Mara is not a pet. She is a trained service dog, certified to perform specific tasks that mitigate my condition. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, I have the legal right to live here with her. No HOA covenant overrides federal law." For a moment, silence filled the room. Then Sabrina scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. "PTSD. That's just stress. Everyone has stress. You don't look disabled." "You tackled me, for God's sake. Clearly you don't need a dog to function." Gasps echoed from the audience. Some neighbors shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded along with her. My fists clenched, but Daniel's voice echoed in my mind. "Stay calm, stay factual. I pulled out the ADA printouts, reading aloud the section on service animals. The law states clearly, you cannot demand disclosure of my medical history. You cannot deny housing accommodations for a legitimate service dog. And yes, Mara is legitimate. I shouldn't have to prove my disability to satisfy your ignorance, but since you questioned it, I held up the letter from my doctor, sealed and signed. This is my medical confirmation. That's all you're getting. And it's more than the law requires. The room buzzed. Some people nodded in support, others whispered angrily. But the tide shifted when Tom Wynn stood up from the back. I served alongside men with PTSD, he said firmly. I know what it looks like, and I know what service dogs mean. If you think this man doesn't need Mara, you're either blind or willfully ignorant. Applause broke out small at first, then louder. Sabrina's smirk faltered. I left that night shaken but not broken. The board didn't vote, at least not yet. They tabled the issue, citing further review. But I knew the war wasn't over. Karen wasn't finished. She never was. Still walking back home with Mara trotting beside me, head held high, I felt a glimmer of something I hadn't in a long time resolve. Because this time I wasn't going to retreat. The morning of the shooting came back to me in fragments like broken shards of glass, reflecting different angles of the same nightmare. The sound of fireworks from a nearby hunting range had already put me on edge. Mara pressed her body into my leg, nudging me with steady pressure, her trained signal that I was spiraling into a panic response. That was the only reason I even made it down the street that morning, to let her work, to let her pull me back from the edge. But Sabrina Karen Cole had other plans. She was standing by the park clutching a revolver, as if she were some Old West sheriff defending the town from bandits. The way she held at arms, stiff finger trembling on the trigger, told me she had no business wielding a weapon. Yet there she was, HOA president turned vigilante, convinced she was delivering justice. "You were warned," she shouted. "No dogs allowed. If you won't follow the rules, then I'll make you." Before I could process the insanity of it, before I could even raise my hands, the revolver cracked. A flash, a bang, and Mara's yelp split the morning open. I don't remember making the decision to move. My body acted before my brain caught up. I lunged, adrenaline overriding every ounce of fear. In combat, you don't think you react. 1 second Karen was standing there with her gun, the next she was pinned beneath me, the revolver skidding across the pavement. Neighbors screamed, some ducked behind hedges, others pulled out their phones. I barely noticed. My vision tunneled until there was only me, Karen, and the weapon I had to keep away from her. I twisted her wrist, wrenched the revolver free, and tossed it across the grass. "Get off me!" she shrieked, thrashing. "He's attacking me! He's crazy!" But then Mara whimpered. That sound cut through the fog like a blade. I turned my head just enough to see her collapsed, trembling blood staining her fur. The sight of her struggling to lift her head still, trying to focus on me even in pain, shattered me. The world tilted, my chest constricted, the edges of my vision closed in. The panic attack hit like a freight train, triggered not by combat this time, but by the thought of losing the one being who anchored me to reality. My muscles seized my breath, came in gasps, and I barely heard the sirens growing louder. When the police arrived, they found me shaking uncontrollably, still on top of Karen, who was screaming accusations at the top of her lungs. Officers pried me off, secured the revolver, and pulled Karen to her feet in handcuffs. Through the chaos, I remember one neighbor's voice above the others. I got it on video. He was defending himself. She fired first. That video would save me later. But in that moment, none of it mattered. I collapsed onto the curb, my body no longer obeying me. I caught one last glimpse of Mara being carried toward a waiting car, her head lolling but her eyes still locked on mine. Then the darkness swallowed me. The next time I opened my eyes, the sterile glow of hospital lights surrounded me. My arms felt heavy, my chest tight. Machines beeped softly at my side. For a moment, I thought I'd woken up back overseas in a field hospital after an IED blast. But the sound of soft whimpering pulled me back to reality. Mara was there, bandaged, exhausted, but alive. She sat on the floor beside my bed, tail thumping weakly when she saw me stir. Relief flooded me so hard it brought tears I didn't even try to stop. A nurse smiled gently. The vet cleared her. "She's lucky. You both are." I reached down with trembling hands, running my fingers through her fur. She pressed her nose into my palm as if to say, "I'm still here. I'm not going anywhere." But the reprieve didn't last long. 2 detectives arrived that afternoon, notepads in hand. They explained what had happened after I blacked out. Karen had been arrested on the spot, charged with reckless endangerment, animal cruelty, and unlawful discharge of a firearm in a residential area. They confirmed what neighbors had told them, that I tackled her only after she fired. that my response was considered self-defense. Still, the words felt surreal. Karen, the queen of HOA pettiness, had crossed the line from fines and flyers to felony charges. "She's out on bail already," one detective added grimly. "Stay cautious. We've issued a no-contact order, but given her history," he let the sentence hang. I swallowed hard. She shot my dog. What more could she possibly do? The detective's expression was the kind that says, "You don't want to know." The following days blurred into a haze of hospital visits and paperwork. Mara recovered faster than I did. Her wound, though painful, was physical and finite. Mine were messier, invisible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the revolver flash, heard her cry, felt the weight of Karen's wrist under my grip. But what cut deeper were the whispers. Even as Karen faced charges, her allies in the neighborhood didn't stay silent. On the community Facebook group, she painted herself as the real victim. "I was attacked by a man with violent tendencies," she posted. "He used his so-called service dog as an excuse to break our rules." I feared for my life. A handful of residents bought her story, repeating it like gospel. Some called me dangerous, unstable, unfit to live in Magnolia Springs. Others claimed Mara was a threat to children, that service animals were just loopholes for lazy people. I wanted to scream. Instead, I documented. Screenshots, flyers, every post and comment into the folder Daniel, my lawyer, told me to keep. "Truth wins when it's written down," he said. "Emotions fade, evidence doesn't." But one evening, Tom Wynn knocked on my door again, his face grim. "They're planning something bigger," he warned. "Karen might be facing charges, but she's rallying the board. They're talking about calling a special meeting to revoke your right to keep Mara in the neighborhood." My gut twisted. "They can't do that. Federal law." "I know," Tom interrupted. "But they'll try anyway. And if they succeed even temporarily, you'll be forced out. You need to be ready." I glanced down at Mara, curled at my feet, her ears flicking as if she understood every word. For her, I had already fought once. I'd fight again. The park where the shooting happened became a ghost zone. No kids played there anymore, no families picnicked under the oaks. Every time I passed it, I saw the chalk outline police had drawn where the revolver fell. A scar in the neighborhood as permanent as the one carved into my memory. I thought about moving, packing up, leaving Magnolia Springs behind. But that's what Karen wanted. Bullies thrive when people retreat. And for once, I refused to be pushed out. Mara deserved better. I deserved better. So when the letter arrived in my mailbox a week later, stamped with the HOA logo summoning me to a disciplinary hearing, I didn't crumble. I didn't retreat. I clipped Mara's vest onto her shoulders, gathered my folder of evidence, and called Daniel. "This is it," he said. "Their last play. If we stand firm, if we show them the law, this won't just protect you, it'll set a precedent. They'll never be able to pull this stunt again." The thought steadied me. For the first time, in a long time, I felt ready. Because Karen might have fired the first shot, but I was about to deliver the final blow, armed not with fists or fury, but with the one thing she never respected: the law. When I walked into the hospital conference room for the official police debrief, the fluorescent lights buzzed above me like an interrogation lamp. My palms sweated, even though the air conditioning was on full blast. Mara sat beside me, alert but calm, her vest neatly strapped across her back. The bandage on her shoulder was smaller, now proof that she was healing faster than my nerves. Detective Alvarez, the lead investigator, clicked his pen and started the recorder. "For the record, Mr. Walker, this meeting is to confirm the sequence of events on the day of September 14th, when Miss Sabrina Cole discharged a firearm in a residential area and your service dog was injured. Please speak clearly and take your time." I swallowed, trying to keep my voice steady as I recounted every detail. The walk, the fireworks in the distance, Karen standing at the edge of the park, revolver shaking in her hands, the deafening crack, Mara's cry. My body reacting before my mind, tackling Karen, wrestling the weapon away. As I spoke, my chest tightened. Words blurred into flashes of sound and color, the metallic taste in my mouth, the grass pressed into my cheek, the screams of neighbors. My breathing quickened until Mara pressed her weight against my leg, grounding me. That steady pressure pulled me back just enough to finish. Detective Alvarez nodded, slowly jotting notes. "We have multiple witness statements and a video from one of your neighbors that corroborates your account. The district attorney will likely pursue aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, animal cruelty, and reckless endangerment. She'll be facing serious charges." I should have felt relief. Instead, all I could think about was the fact that Karen was already back home free on bail, probably plotting her next move. Sure enough, my phone buzzed later that evening. Tom Nguyen had forwarded me screenshots from the HOA group chat. Karen was spinning the story. "He attacked me. I only fired because I was afraid for my life. That dog lunged first. Some neighbors defended her while others expressed outrage. The community was divided, and I was stuck in the middle of the battlefield. That's when Daniel, my lawyer, stepped in with a strategy. He met me at the hospital the next morning, a stack of legal documents tucked under his arm. "Here's the good news," he said, spreading papers across the table. "You are fully protected under the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. A service dog is considered medical equipment. Shooting Mara is no different than smashing someone's oxygen tank or yanking away their wheelchair. That's a federal violation." He tapped another page. On top of that, the Fair Housing Act requires the HOA to make reasonable accommodations for service animals. Their covenant about no dogs cannot override federal law. They're playing checkers. We're playing chess. For the first time since the shooting, I felt a flicker of confidence. But Daniel wasn't done. Now here's the bad news. Karen's already poisoning the well. She's got allies on the board. They're calling a disciplinary hearing trying to vote you out. They'll argue PTSD isn't a real disability, that you don't look disabled, and if they get enough support, they'll make your life hell. I clenched my fists. So what do? Daniel's eyes sharpened. We fight on two fronts. In court, we nail her with the ADA violations, animal cruelty, and firearm charges. But in the community, we show them who you really are. We make them see you're not some fraud. They're attacking a veteran who gave everything for his country and now just wants to live in peace with his service dog. His words hit me harder than I expected. I'd never been comfortable waving my military service around like a shield. But this wasn't about pride, it was survival. The first step was evidence. I spent the next few days compiling everything: Karen's flyers, her Facebook rants, the HOA email Tom had slipped me. I had screenshots of her claiming PTSD was just stress and calling service animals glorified pets. Daniel smiled grimly as he flipped through the pile. "This is gold," he said. "She doesn't realize she's already convicted herself publicly. We'll use her own words against her." Meanwhile, Mara's recovery became the neighborhood's unexpected rallying point. Nurses at the hospital had adored her, showering her with treats while she lay curled at the foot of my bed. When she was finally cleared to come home full-time, word spread quickly. Families stopped me during walks, children offering her gentle pats, neighbors slipping biscuits into my hand. But just as many avoided me altogether crossing the street or muttering under their breath. Karen's influence was still strong. She painted herself as the guardian of Magnolia Springs' purity, while I was cast as the intruder with a dangerous dog. One night I heard voices outside my window. Teenagers egged on by gossip chanting "no dogs, no frauds" before sprinting away. I clenched my jaw, Mara pressing against me until my breathing slowed. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just a personal battle, it was a cultural one, a clash between ignorance and law, fear and understanding. A week later, Daniel called me into his office. "Big development," he said, sliding a folder across the desk. Inside was a copy of the ASPCA's report confirming Mara's injuries and labeling the incident as animal cruelty. This isn't just local anymore. Animal rights groups are watching, and the ADA office has been notified. Sabrina doesn't just face state charges now, she's looking at federal scrutiny. For a woman who thrived on control, the idea of federal agencies breathing down her neck was poetic justice. But Daniel wanted more. "I recommend you testify in uniform," he said carefully. "It's your choice, but it sends a powerful message. The jury won't just see a man with a dog, they'll see a veteran who served his country now under attack in his own neighborhood." I hesitated. The thought of putting that uniform back on made my chest ache. But when I looked down at Mara resting her head on my boot, I knew he was right. This wasn't about me anymore. It was about ensuring no one else could ever try to strip a veteran or anyone with a service dog of their rights again. The night before the hearing, Tom stopped by with a 6-pack of root beer. "Just in case you forget," he said, clapping me on the shoulder, "you're not alone. A lot of us know what she did was wrong. Don't let her make you doubt that." I nodded grateful. Mara barked once, as if agreeing. That night I lay awake, replaying everything that had led to this moment. The gunshot, the hospital, the flyers, the whispers, and now the looming showdown, not in a battlefield overseas, but in a suburban clubhouse where justice would be decided not by bullets, but by words. I drifted into restless sleep with one thought anchoring me tomorrow. I would face Karen not as her victim, but as her reckoning. The next morning I buttoned my uniform shirt slowly, each stitch a reminder of battles fought and sacrifices made. The fabric felt heavy, weighted with memories, but also with purpose. Mara sat patiently as I adjusted her vest, her eyes locked on mine. She seemed to understand. When I stepped out the door, neighbors paused mid-conversation, their gazes shifting from me to Mara, then back again. Some nodded respectfully. Others looked away, but no one spoke. The silence was louder than any words. At the clubhouse, the parking lot was packed. Cars lined the street reporters' vans among them. The story had spread beyond Magnolia Springs. Now it was news. Inside the board sat stiffly at a long table. Karen was there too, her face pale but still twisted with arrogance. She sneered when she saw me in uniform. I didn't flinch, because for the first time I felt the balance shifting. She had fired the gun, but I was about to fire back with truth, with law, and with every ounce of resolve Mara had given me. And this time she wouldn't walk away unscathed. The courtroom looked smaller than I imagined, like a fishbowl, where the smallest ripple in the water is magnified tenfold. The morning sunlight cut through the blinds and painted bars across the carpet. I sat beneath them in my uniform because Daniel had insisted. People see the uniform, they see service, he said. Mara lay quietly at my feet, ears flicking at every murmur. It felt surreal, from the manicured lawns of Magnolia Springs to a federal-adjacent hearing room where the balance of power could finally be measured by law, not by gossip. Karen arrived, flanked by a lawyer who looked like he'd been auditioned from a corporate PR catalog. Expensive suit, perfect smile, and more confidence than any one person deserved. She kept her head-high gloves on despite the heat, like she hadn't a care in the world. The irony wasn't lost on me. She had the nerve to look composed after pulling a gun on a service animal. The DA's office had piled on state charges, reckless discharge, animal cruelty assault with a deadly weapon, and now Daniel was pursuing civil remedies and federal claims under the ADA and the Fair Housing Act. This wasn't just about punishment, it was about precedent. The prosecutor started by laying out the timeline. They played the neighbor's video, the grainy footage that would be replayed on local news for weeks, over and over. The sound of the single gunshot looped until it lodged in my head like a splinter. The camera caught Karen raising the revolver, the muzzle flash, the stagger of Mara as she yelped, and then my body moving before thought tackle wrestled the gun, skidding away. The video was the spine of the case, everything else slotted around it. Karen's attorney tried to paint a different picture. He argued she feared for her safety, that the presence of a large dog in a dog-free community constituted a threat, that she acted in self-defense because she claimed the dog had lunged at her. It was a flimsy defense, thin enough that a jury should have seen it through, but he had a playbook that didn't rely solely on facts. He relied on optics. He trotted out Karen's flyers, her carefully curated social media posts, and a parade of neighbors who'd been swayed by years of HOA meetings and passive-aggressive newsletters. He wanted to make the judge and any observers believe they were confronting a public safety issue, not an act of cruelty. Daniel stood up calmly when it was our turn. He told the court plain and hard what the ADA requires and protects. A service animal is medical equipment, he said. The ADA is unequivocal. If an individual has a disability and uses a service animal, that animal is allowed in all public spaces and living quarters where the person resides. Shooting a service dog isn't merely an assault on an animal, it is an assault on medical equipment. It's tantamount to shooting oxygen tanks or destroying a prosthetic. The judge's pen paused. You could feel the room lean in. They called me to the stand. My hands shook when I took the oath, but Mara's warm body at my feet steadied me. I recounted everything deployment, the nights I couldn't sleep, the first time Mara pulled me through a panic attack the morning in the park. I told the judge about the flyers, the Facebook posts, the whispered conversations overheard at the grocery store. When I spoke about Mara's training interrupting severe anxiety attacks, providing deep pressure therapy, I tried not to let my voice break. I didn't want my trauma to become a spectacle. I wanted it to be understood as law and need not drama. Cross-examination was merciless. Karen's lawyer tried to make me look unstable, to twist my very diagnosis into ammunition. You tackled my client, he snarled. Doesn't that show a propensity for violence? How can you be trusted to live in community? It was a cheap sting and my chest tightened. Then something happened that I hadn't expected. A former HOA board member, Mrs. Alvarez, a woman with a reputation for no-nonsense candor, stepped forward and told the court under oath what she'd whispered to Tom and me behind closed doors. She admitted the HOA had always treated exceptions for certified service animals as permissible, and that Karen had pushed for unilateral enforcement of a no-dogs clause she had misinterpreted and weaponized. Her testimony cracked open the veneer of the HOA's righteousness and exposed it as politically motivated cruelty. The courtroom murmured. Karen's face flushed. Her lawyer shifted like a hound, sensing a change in the scent. Daniel seized the moment. He brought in the HOA's internal communications emails, where Karen lobbied for strict enforcement notes, where she'd suggested making an example out of my case. The files were public stamped and entered as exhibit evidence. Her own words were now the scaffold on which the legal case was built. Beyond the county charges, the Ada and fair housing claims were David and Goliath level. Daniel pressed for an injunction against the HOA to force them to adopt written policies consistent with federal law, mandatory ADA training for all board members, explicit procedures for reasonable accommodation requests, and a requirement to remove any covenant language that could be interpreted as overriding federal protections. The judge listened, brows knitted, and asked hard questions about whether the HOA's bylaws had been used selectively. The answer from the evidence was damning. During a recess, a woman approached me, one of the neighbors who'd been ambivalent at the board meeting. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know. I thought you were making it up." She choked out an apology, hands trembling. These moments mattered. One converted neighbor was worth a dozen blog posts. Public perception was shifting slowly but steadily from seeing me as an interloper to seeing me as a man defending his medical rights. Then the twist landed. Midway through testimony, the ASPCA's representative testified that Karen's actions were not only reckless, but would likely be classified as animal cruelty under state law because of the calculated nature of the act her intent to enforce, rules notwithstanding. That was when federal attention sharpened. Suddenly, this wasn't a neighborhood squabble. It had the potential to cascade into federal enforcement of housing rights and animal welfare oversight. Karen's bail conditions were reviewed. The judge extended the no-contact order and ordered Karen to surrender any firearms pending the outcome of her criminal case. It was the first major defeat for her. But the fight wasn't just in court. Karen's lawyer attempted a final smear. He subpoenaed a couple of my private medical records, trying to pry open details of my diagnosis beyond what Ada allows to make a spectacle out of my trauma. Daniel stood up like a dam, objecting that the ADA forbids forcing disclosure of clinical details. The judge agreed. The court protected my privacy. That ruling itself set a quiet but powerful legal precedent. You cannot weaponize someone's medical history to justify violent acts against their medical equipment. The trial ran for days, packed with testimony, emotional testimony, and legal maneuvering. In between the formal sparring community, life-churned petitions circulated supporting me. Local news did feature pieces that humanized my story, and a small group of us organized a peaceful walk for service animals and veterans through Magnolia Springs. It was a simple act, neighbors with leashes, kids with posters, Mara leading the way, that turned a place of fear into briefly a place of solidarity. When the judge finally read a pre-trial order that favored the ADA claims and mandated immediate HOA policy changes pending the civil suit, it felt like someone had rung a bell in my chest. Karen's criminal trial was still on the calendar, but the civil protections were a major victory. The HOA was ordered to retract defamatory flyers, remove any covenant language contradicting federal law, and conduct ADA training for its board and staff. They were not allowed to harass me or Mara. Any violation would result in fines and contempt charges. Walking out of the courthouse that day, Mara's leash in my hand, Sunlight, felt different. It wasn't victory yet. The legal system is long and cumbersome, but a clear line had been drawn. The law recognized what I'd been saying: service animals are protected, and people who take it upon themselves to harm medical equipment will answer for it. Back in Magnolia Springs, the reaction was mixed. Some neighbors clapped us as we walked past. Others averted their gaze. Karen's house sat quiet, its blinds closed like an embarrassed person hiding from the world. But the important part wasn't the headlines or the gossip. It was that my case had forced a small community to confront ugly truths about power and prejudice, and forced its leaders to be accountable under federal law. That night, Mara curled up on my lap as if she understood the gravity of the day. I stroked her ears and felt the raw edges of my trauma ease a fraction. We had walked through fire and come out marked but breathing. The fight wasn't over. There would be hearings, maybe appeals, and the criminal case still loomed. But for the first time since that gunshot split the morning, I felt something like hope, because the law had finally listened. The day of the HOA disciplinary hearing arrived like a storm cloud that had been building for weeks. I'd faced bullets before, but walking into that clubhouse packed wall to wall with neighbors, board members, and even a few reporters felt like stepping into hostile territory without cover. The air was thick with whispers. Some eyes met mine with sympathy, others with thinly veiled suspicion. At my side, Mara padded calmly, her vest gleaming, her gait steady despite the scar hidden under her fur. She seemed to know she was walking me into battle. At the head of the room sat the HOA board, 5 members in pressed blazers, stiff as mannequins. and in the middle, like a queen enthroned, was Karen. Her pearl necklace gleamed under the fluorescent lights, her smirk sharp enough to cut glass. Even facing criminal charges, she still radiated arrogance as though she owned every blade of grass in Magnolia Springs. Order. The chairman began rapping his gavel. We are here to address the alleged violation of Magnolia Springs' covenant regarding pets, specifically the issue of Mr. Walker keeping a German Shepherd in a dog-free community. Karen leaned toward her microphone, her voice syrupy and cruel. This is not personal, she said, though her eyes never left mine. This is about rules. If we bend them for one man, we risk chaos. Magnolia Springs was founded on the principle of order. That order is threatened by individuals who think federal law is a free pass to ignore community standards. I clenched my jaw, but Daniel rested a hand on my arm. Patience, he whispered. She's hanging herself. Then it was my turn. I stood adjusting my uniform, feeling every eye on me. My name is James Walker, I said, my voice echoing in the stillness. I am a veteran of the United States Army. I live with post-traumatic stress disorder. My service dog Mara is not a pet. She is a trained medical service animal certified under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Federal law guarantees my right to live with her. No HOA covenant overrides that law. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Karen's lips tightened. I continued. Mara is trained to interrupt panic attacks, provide deep pressure therapy, and keep me grounded during flashbacks. She is as essential to me as oxygen to a person with lung disease. Shooting her or trying to take her from me is no different than smashing medical equipment, and that's exactly what Miss Cole did when she pulled a gun on her. Gasps filled the room. Even some of her allies shifted uncomfortably. Karen slammed her hand on the table. Lies? That dog lunged at me. I defended myself. Before Daniel could respond, the chairman raised a hand. We have evidence. He gestured, and the neighbor's video appeared on the projector. The room went silent as the footage played. Karen raising the revolver, the muzzle flash, Mara collapsing me, tackling her. The video didn't lie. The board squirmed. Karen's face flushed crimson. This is self-defense, I asked quietly, turning toward her, pointing a gun at a service dog in a public park, shooting in the direction of homes and children. You didn't defend yourself. You attacked me, and every federal protection I'm guaranteed. The room buzzed like a hive. Someone in the back shouted, "He's right." Another voice, "She nearly killed a dog." The chairman cleared his throat. Enough. We'll recess for 10 minutes. As people milled around, Tom Wynn stepped to the microphone without permission. I served as a firefighter for 30 years, he said firmly. I've seen real danger, real threats. That man's dog wasn't one of them. What I saw was a neighbor with a gun trying to play sheriff. If this board has any integrity, it will protect the rights of our veterans and stop letting personal vendettas dictate policy. Applause erupted. Karen scowled, hissing at her lawyer. When the board reconvened, Daniel presented his trump card, the leaked HOA emails. In them, Karen had written to the board about making an example of me, about proving PTSD is fake, about reestablishing control. Her words were venom now preserved forever as exhibits. She had built her own gallows. The chairman paled as he read. Miss Cole, these emails are troubling. Karen tried to bluster. Taken out of context, fabricated. But Daniel produced the metadata showing timestamp server trails. Authentic, undeniable. The crowd erupted again this time, with boos aimed squarely at Karen. The board had no choice. They voted unanimously, 4-1, to affirm that Mara was a legally protected service animal and that the HOA would immediately update its bylaws to align with federal law. Karen, the lone dissenter, slammed her gavel down so hard it cracked. This isn't over, she spat, standing abruptly. You'll regret crossing me. She stormed out, cameras flashing as reporters swarmed her. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in months. Mara leaned into me, tail wagging slightly. The battle wasn't done, criminal court still awaited, but in that clubhouse the tide had turned. But victory came with new scars. That night, an anonymous note appeared under my door. Traitor. You don't belong here. Eggshells splattered across my porch. Someone keyed the side of my truck. The whispers hadn't died. They'd simply gone underground. Karen's allies were lashing out, desperate to hold on to the crumbling illusion of control. Daniel assured me it was expected. When people like her lose, they thrash. But the law is on your side now. Keep documenting. Every note, every threat, every act of vandalism, it strengthens our case. I nodded, though, a knot still tightened in my gut. The battlefield had shifted from boardrooms to shadows, and that made it more unpredictable. Still, there were glimmers of hope. Neighbors I barely knew knocked on my door to offer support. One woman baked cookies, whispering, "For Mara." Kids drew pictures of service dogs with capes slipping them into my mailbox. The divide was still there, but so was solidarity. And then came the most unexpected ally, the HOA itself. The board released an official statement condemning Karen's actions, insisting her behavior did not reflect the values of Magnolia Springs. Cynical as it sounded, more like damage control than compassion, it was still public support. It gave me breathing room. The criminal trial loomed, and with it the possibility of prison time for Karen. Her lawyer scrambled, filing motions to dismiss, to suppress the video, to argue PTSD wasn't a disability under ADA. Each was shot down. The judge had seen enough. And when Karen finally appeared in court, stripped of her HOA gavel and pearl necklace, she looked smaller. Not harmless, never harmless, but diminished. She had gone from queen of the cul-de-sac to defendant in shackles. As I sat in the gallery, Mara's head on my boot, I realized the revenge wasn't in seeing her punished. It was in knowing she'd never hold power over me again. For the first time since that gunshot, I believed we could finally live in peace. The courthouse smelled faintly of dust and old wood polish, the kind of scent that clings to places where history lingers. I had walked into battles where the enemy was armed and invisible, but nothing compared to the weight of walking into a courtroom where your whole life is placed under a microscope. Mara trotted beside me, her vest gleaming. Reporters crowded the steps, microphones thrust forward, their questions slicing through the air like bullets. "Mr. Walker, do you feel safe with Karen out on bail? Do you think the HOA encouraged her actions? Will you be pursuing additional damages?" I ignored them, my hand brushing Mara's ear. She stayed calm, guiding me through the swarm like she always did, anchoring me with her presence. If she could remain steady, so could I. Inside, the room was packed. Neighbors from Magnolia Springs, animal rights advocates, veterans in their dress uniforms, even a few strangers who'd read about the case online. Karen sat at the defense table, pearl necklace gone, her hair pulled back too tightly, her smirk replaced with something thinner, defiance edged with fear. Her lawyer shuffled papers like a magician, desperate to find one last trick. The prosecutor stood first, addressing the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about accountability. The defendant, Sabrina Cole, discharged a firearm in a suburban park, injuring a trained service dog and endangering residents. She claims she was enforcing HOA bylaws, but bylaws do not override federal law. They do not justify violence. They do not give anyone the right to shoot a service animal, a medical necessity, because they dislike it. This was reckless, cruel, and criminal." Then Daniel rose, representing me in the civil proceedings tied to the case. His words were sharp, deliberate. "This isn't just about one man and his dog. This is about whether we allow ignorance and arrogance to strip away federally protected rights. If we let HOAs, or self-appointed enforcers, decide who deserves accommodations, then every veteran, every disabled person is at risk." Karen's lawyer countered with venom, insisting Mara was a dangerous animal and I was unstable. He even played clips from Karen's Facebook rants, trying to frame her as a whistleblower rather than a vigilante. But each attempt landed flat. The video of her firing the revolver was undeniable. Witness after witness described the scene. Tom Newen testified again, his voice steady, describing the moment Mara yelped and collapsed, how Karen raised her arm deliberately, how children in nearby yards screamed in fear. When I took the stand, the room quieted. My uniform felt heavier than armor. Mara lay at my feet, her steady breathing echoing louder in my head than the shuffling of papers. I spoke slowly, choosing each word with care. "I fought overseas," I said, my voice low. "I came back carrying battles inside me. PTSD isn't visible, but it's real. Mara is trained to pull me back when panic takes over. She's the reason I can stand here at all. When Karen shot her, she didn't just hurt my dog, she tried to take away the one thing keeping me alive." Karen's lawyer tried to rattle me. "You tackled my client, didn't you? Isn't that violent behavior?" I met his gaze. "I tackled her after she fired a weapon in a residential park. I disarmed her to prevent more shots. That's not violence, that's survival." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Then came the twist no one expected. A junior board member, someone who had always sat silently in Karen's shadow, took the stand under subpoena. She revealed that Karen had pressured the board for months, insisting Magnolia Springs should become an HOA with teeth. In one email, Karen wrote, "If we bend for one veteran, we'll bend for all. I'll handle it myself if I have to." The jury saw the email projected on the screen. It was the nail in the coffin. Karen hadn't acted out of fear, she'd acted with intent. When the verdict came, the room held its breath. Guilty on reckless endangerment, guilty on animal cruelty, guilty on unlawful discharge of a firearm. The judge's gavel struck like thunder. Karen's sentence: 1 year in county jail, suspended with 5 years of probation, mandatory psychiatric evaluation, permanent loss of firearm rights, and a $50,000 fine, payable in part to cover Mara's veterinary bills and in part as punitive damages. She was also barred from serving on any HOA board ever again. But the real hammer fell in the civil ruling. The court ordered Magnolia Springs HOA to publicly apologize, implement ADA and FHA training for all board members, and amend its bylaws to explicitly recognize service animals. The community was fined for failing to curb Karen's abuse of power, and damages were awarded to me for emotional distress. For once, the law didn't just speak, it roared. Karen sat frozen as the sentence was read, her hands clenched white. When deputies led her away, she twisted back to glare at me, spitting. This isn't over, but her voice cracked, stripped of the authority she once wielded. Walking out of that courtroom, Mara at my side, the air felt different, lighter. The crowd outside wasn't just reporters now. Neighbors approached with handshakes, veterans saluted, kids patted Mara gently. For every whisper of hate, there were now voices of support. Back in Magnolia Springs, the HOA scrambled to repair its reputation. A letter arrived at my house on official stationery. We regret the actions of our former president. They do not represent the values of our community. We welcome you and your service dog as valued members of Magnolia Springs. Whether it was sincere or a desperate attempt at damage control, I didn't care. The message was clear: Karen's reign was over. A week later, something extraordinary happened. The community organized a service dog walk in the very park where the shooting had occurred. Families came with leashed pets, veterans marched in uniform, children carried signs reading "Service Dogs Save Lives" and "Mara Strong." For the first time since moving in, I felt the weight on my chest ease. Mara walked proudly at my side, a red bandana tied around her neck, tail wagging as if she knew this was her victory lap. Karen's house went dark soon after. A "For Sale" sign appeared on the lawn, her blinds forever shut. She had lost not just her case, but her kingdom. That evening, I sat on my porch with Mara, watching the sunset paint the sky. Neighbors waved as they passed. Some stopped to talk. For months, I had lived as a target. Now I was part of something again. "Good girl," I whispered, scratching behind Mara's ears. She licked my hand, her eyes warm and steady. She had carried me through war, through trauma, through the madness of an HOA queen with a gun, and together we had won. The sweetest revenge wasn't seeing Karen in handcuffs. It was knowing that Magnolia Springs would never be the same again, and that Mara, against all odds, had turned a battlefield into a place of healing. The morning after Karen's sentencing, Magnolia Springs woke up to a different kind of silence. Not the tense, suffocating hush that had haunted the neighborhood since the gunshot, but something closer to relief. For the first time in months, kids were back on their bikes. The pool deck was lively again, and the park, the same patch of grass that had once echoed with the crack of a revolver, now hosted joggers and dog walkers. The shadow of Karen's tyranny was lifting. But healing doesn't happen overnight. For me, the hardest battles weren't fought in courtrooms or HOA meetings. They were fought in the quiet of my own mind. Even after the verdict, I found myself flinching at sudden noises, my chest tightening when I walked past Karen's house, still unsold, its "For Sale" sign creaking in the wind. Trauma doesn't vanish with a gavel strike. It lingers, seeping into every crack of daily life. And yet every time the darkness crept in, Mara was there. She'd nudge me during panic spells, press her weight against me when nightmares pulled me under, and remind me without words that I wasn't alone. She had been shot, scarred, and yet she carried herself with calm certainty, a living testament that survival is possible. The HOA, under court order, began its transformation. Mandatory ADA and Fair Housing Act workshops were scheduled, run by disability rights advocates. For once, the clubhouse projector wasn't used to shame neighbors about lawn heights or mailbox paint, but to educate people about service animals, invisible disabilities, and the limits of HOA authority. Attendance was mandatory for all board members. The irony of watching stiff, self-important board members scribble notes about federal protections wasn't lost on me. It felt like poetic justice. One evening, the new interim president, an older gentleman named Robert Lang, knocked on my door. He wasn't flashy, just a soft-spoken retired school principal with a reputation for fairness. He handed me a printed apology letter from the board. "I know words won't undo what you've been through," he said, "but I want you to know the HOA is changing. And it starts with making sure Mara is not just tolerated here, but welcomed." Mara trotted over and licked his hand. Robert chuckled. "She's got better judgment than most of us." The apology didn't erase the vandalism I'd endured, the anonymous notes, the keyed truck. But it was something. A step. The sweetest moment of all came a week later. The neighborhood, led by Tom Wynn and a few other residents, organized the walk for vets and service dogs. It wasn't my idea. I actually tried to avoid the spotlight, but Tom insisted. "This isn't just for you," he said. "It's for everyone who needs to know their rights are worth fighting for." On the day of the walk, the park filled with families, veterans, and more dogs than I could count. Some wore vests like Mara's, others just wagged their tails happily. Children held handmade signs: "Mara Strong Service, Dogs Save Lives, Respect the Law." Even local news crews showed up, cameras rolling. When it was my turn to speak, I froze. My throat tightened, my chest heavy with the weight of eyes on me. But then Mara nudged me, pressing her head into my palm. Her steady gaze anchored me like it always did. So I spoke. I didn't want to be here telling this story. I didn't want my dog shot. I didn't want to fight my neighbors in court. But we don't always get to choose our battles. Sometimes they choose us. Mara isn't just a dog. She's my partner, my lifeline, my medical support. And when someone tried to take her from me, I had to fight not just for her, but for everyone who's ever needed a service animal, and for every veteran who comes home carrying invisible wounds. Applause erupted, not polite but thunderous. For the first time, I didn't feel like an outsider in Magnolia Springs. I felt like part of a community. Meanwhile, Karen's house sat empty, blinds drawn tight. Rumors swirled. Some said she'd moved in with family out of state. Others claimed she'd been seen at a halfway house fulfilling her probation requirements. I didn't care. For once, she wasn't my problem. Her kingdom of flyers and bylaws had crumbled, and all she had left were the consequences. The HOA newsletter, once a weapon Karen wielded to shame residents, now carried a new headline: "Magnolia Springs welcomes change." Below it was a photo of Mara, tongue out, flanked by kids holding their signs from the walk. It was surreal seeing her celebrated in the very community that had once branded her illegal. As the weeks passed, life began to settle into something resembling normalcy. I found part-time work with a local veterans outreach program, helping other service members transition back into civilian life. Ironically, Mara became a star of the program. New veterans would meet her, learn about her role, and realize service animals weren't a luxury but a lifeline. She turned into an ambassador for survival, her story whispered with reverence. Neighbors who once crossed the street to avoid me now stopped to ask about her training, to apologize for their silence, to offer quiet support. It didn't erase the scars, but it softened them. Magnolia Springs was learning. Slowly, awkwardly, but learning. And me, I was learning too. Learning that strength isn't about tackling enemies to the ground or even about winning in court. Sometimes strength is about staying about, refusing to be pushed out of your home, about standing with your dog in front of neighbors who doubt you and saying, "I belong here." The irony was sharp. Karen had wanted me gone, erased from Magnolia Springs. Instead, she had cemented me here. Through her cruelty, she had forced the HOA to reform, forced neighbors to open their eyes, and forced me to find a voice I hadn't used since the battlefield. On quiet evenings now, I sit on my porch with Mara at my feet, watching the sunset spill gold over the cul-de-sac. Sometimes kids ride by on scooters and wave. Sometimes Tom joins me with a beer, the two of us sharing stories of fires and firefights. And sometimes, just sometimes, I hear laughter from the park instead of echoes of gunfire. Mara lifts her head ears, perked as if asking, "We made it, didn't we?" And the answer at last is yes. This story isn't just about an HOA gone rogue or a neighbor who let arrogance and fear turn into violence. It's about resilience. About how, even in the face of ignorance, cruelty, and doubt, you can stand firm, especially when you have something worth fighting for. For me, that was Mara. She reminded me daily that healing is possible, that loyalty is unbreakable, and that strength often looks like quiet persistence, not loud defiance. If you take anything from this, let it be this: never underestimate the battles people fight silently, and never ever try to strip away the tools they use to survive. Compassion is stronger than rules, and empathy is more powerful than pride. If you've ever faced your own Karen or fought to be believed, know that you're not alone. Share your story in the comments, I'd love to read them. And if Mara's journey inspired you, subscribe to the channel. Together, we can build a community stronger than any HOA rulebook.